Okay, testing. Welcome. Testing 1, 2, 3. For people at home, we're glad you're here. If you're listening, if you're able to hear, does it sound good? Yeah. Our sound man in the back, who also teaches a course on film here at the church, is checking the sound. We all good? I'm sure you can hear in here. Hello. So welcome. And is this little picture we're all good? Well, welcome anybody that's watching anytime during the course of the week. Live, it's Sunday morning here at First Presbyterian Church in York, and we're glad you're here. If you are watching at home, this hybrid church is a whole new way of doing things. So we're glad you're watching. We're glad for the people in the room. Welcome, everybody. You probably know my name is Byron, and the Christian Ed class has been doing this little class on the resurrection season we are in, Eastertide, some call it, after the resurrection, and wondering how does one live with the He is risen sort of exuberant hope that we have on Sunday morning, on Easter morning, if you don't just quite feel it? What are the reasons why maybe sometimes we don't experience or encounter that kind of joy, hope? So we looked last week, the week before that, a whole variety of things. People shared reasons why we struggle. And then last week we looked at doubt. And this week we're going to look at some just emotional stuff, our feelings, and try to talk a little bit about feelings. And we'll get to some of the complexities of that and what the Bible may say about that in a minute. But in between doubt and feelings, this isn't quite a review of last week, but it is sort of something that could have been said last week, that my sense is, and maybe you have feelings about this, that some people who say they have doubt, in fact, don't have intellectual doubts. You know, that we looked at that Caravaggio painting of Thomas saying, I won't believe until I touch Jesus. Good for him, because he wanted to know what was true, and we applaud him and don't scold a doubter. That's a good thing, and doubt is healthy. I said that Frederick Buechner, the Presbyterian writer, calls it the ants in the pants of faith. It just keeps us on our toes, doubt can. But there's some of us who don't, it's not that we don't sort of believe that Jesus rose from the dead and died for our sins and so forth, that the Bible is historically relevant and accurate and stuff. It's more that we don't have hope in those things. And I don't exactly know what hope is. It's not a feeling, but it's more than just a conviction, because you can believe, yes, I believe Jesus rose from the dead and someday we'll make all things new, but I still don't sort of live into that joy. So I'm not even sure what hope is. So I want to start a little bit with just meandering around that question and wondering if you have any thoughts about it. You know, there's an old civil rights guy that used to paraphrase that verse in Hebrews that says faith is the belief in things unseen. The assurance of, yeah. And then the civil rights guy once said, well, hope or faith is believing in the impossible and then watching the evidence change. Believing in the things that there's no real evidence for, but yet when you invest in it, you see the evidence begin to grow and change. And so faith is sort of staking your life on that. It isn't the same as blind faith, because you're watching the evidence grow in front of your eyes. That's what faith is. It's not just blind faith. I heard another person put it like this once. They said blind faith, maybe this is not actually even about hope, but blind faith is sort of taking a leaf off a cliff in the dark. You know, you're lost, you're hiking in Switzerland, you don't know the terrain, you come to the edge, you know you're on a cliff, it's dark, and you think, well, you know, maybe there's land down there, maybe not, I'll just jump. And it could be 100 feet down and you die. But what if you're in that dark, foggy night, lost in the Alps, and you're in the edge of a cliff, and then you hear a voice, and you know from the accent that it's a local guy, and he says, oh, I know just where you are. There's a rock to your right? And you can feel it. And there's a tree probably over there to your left. You can feel it, right? Yeah. Trust me on this. If you jump, it's just like 2 feet down. It's not bad at all. You're not going to die. So it's you still have to jump into the dark, but it's based on some informed evidence that you find reliable, as opposed to a leap in the dark where you just cross your fingers and hope for the best because somebody said, yeah, just jump. So I don't like this idea of a blind leap of faith. But there is some sort of sense in which you have to trust some kind of evidence that you discern to be reliable, and then put your trust in that and then move forward. Well, anyway, that's sort of what faith might be like in terms of evidence. But what if we don't see the evidence change that God's new world is not coming? There is still brokenness in our own lives and in the world, and we don't really see the evidence change. So I just sort of wanted to, I don't have any easy answers about where you find hope, but for what it's worth, my favorite book on these things is called Hope in Times of Fear, The Resurrection and the Meaning of Easter by Tim Keller. Keller wrote a book about faith and stuff a couple of years back when he had thyroid cancer. And it colored his investigation a little bit. He's a preacher in New York. And then he got pancreatic cancer, and he's dying. And so he wrote this book. He has not passed away. No, he is dying, though. I mean, he's very sick. But, I mean, he's facing the treatment and all that stuff. I haven't heard just the last month or two how he's doing. But he wrote this book, having read N.T. Wright's magisterial, 800-page, 900-page, read the book on resurrection, and he said that can't be beat. And so he did the academic work on the resurrection and the reliability of the historical evidence of the resurrection. And he said, so I just want to kind of use that intellectual basis of N.T. Wright, but also my own pain to allow me to talk on the notion of hope. And I mean, we could quote pages and pages in this. I thought all I would do is just to see if somebody is interested in this kind of thing, just to give you the table of contents, and you could decide for yourself. But he talks about a certain hope, that we do have confidence, and that's sort of what the Christian conviction is, a confidence that Christ did raise from the dead, and like the Caravaggio painting, he did touch that body. There's a future hope that we believe it is not yet here yet, but we invest in the sort of, I think he calls it the pregnant future, like it pulls you into the future. There's a glorious hope, there's a subversive hope. He calls it the great reversal, that through death you find life, and there's this just inexplicable paradox at the heart of Christianity, that our hope is not based on victory, but on loss. You know, Jesus died, so it is just a weird religion that we've got that is a paradoxical, that there's a great reversal, that the intuitive thing that you win by winning isn't the way it works. You win by losing. And he looks at that, sort of how that affects your personal life. He says hope for you, hope for your relationships, hope for justice in the world, hope in the face of suffering, and hope for the future. And I had little parts I was going to read, but I just decided I wouldn't. But I just wanted to affirm this book and let you know that there's a whole bunch of ways in which a very thoughtful Reformed thinker has explored the themes of hope. And there's other big theologians at Moltmann and stuff, that's written about hope, but that's my favorite book on hope, except for this. These are two that are even more, not as academic and just more sort of passionate and pastoral. There's a guy named Lou Smedes who maybe you knew at Fuller. Was he still alive?
He had passed away.
He had just died, yeah. He was at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, and then went to Fuller and taught social ethics and ethics there for years and years, and wrote bunches of books. And then he started writing real popular level stuff. He even wrote for Reader's Digest. And even though he was a deep theologian, he popularized his work just for ordinary folks, like in Reader's Digest. This is a book called Keeping Hope Alive for a Tomorrow We Cannot Control. And particularly as we're in a certain age group, we were just talking about illness in our family and COVID and all sorts of things. We can't control the future. So can we move into it sort of placidly? Can we have some hope that things will get better? What do you base that? And so this is just a sweet little book by Lou Smedes, and I wanted to highlight that. I think it's in our church library, Keeping Hope Alive. And then there's this, The Healing Path. And I'd just like to read an excerpt of this to ponder a little this question of hope. It's by Dan Allender, who is a therapist, has written books on sexual abuse and sexual violation and trauma, has a sort of psychological, theological graduate school in Seattle that specializes in training counselors theologically. So it is a graduate school and it's a theological school, but its focus is counseling. And he says when people have been abused, often they lose their faith, hope, and love. You know that bit from the Bible, faith, hope, and love. You lose your faith because you wonder, where was God when this happened? And you lose your ability to love because you can't trust anybody again. And you lose your ability to hope because you can't imagine that you're ever going to get better. And he said when he experiences trauma people, particularly sexual abuse, but trauma people, folks that have experienced trauma, they often finally at the end of the day are struggling with faith, hope, and love. He says when you begin to get better, and that he has books on all that stuff, but when you tend to get better, there's a recovery of faith, hope, and love. You learn to love again. You learn to believe you can find glimmers of hope and you're going to get better. And you realize that God was present with you in the midst of the suffering. He wasn't abandoning you. So this recovery of faith, hope, and love is what this book is about, the healing path it's called. The section on hope, I've read it probably 5 or 6 times in the course of my life. It is just so rich, and there's so much, and the whole chapter is great. But I thought just for our purposes here, I would start with just reading a little bit of this, just so you can hear. I'm not smart enough to say all this stuff. He tells the story about a couple that lost a child. And they were church people, conservative church people, stuck to themselves, loved their family. And between church and home, that's basically all they did. And they lost their baby, and they just were devastated, of course, and began to struggle with their questions of hope and faith. And they were going to get involved. The pastor encouraged them to get involved in a grief recovery group. And they didn't want to do that. She just said, I can't bear it. But at the end of the day, she finally realized they needed to, and they took this risk. And he actually says that part of living into hope is a willingness to take risks. So they risked getting involved in this group, and then the group, ended the long story, ends up asking them to help lead a group. And they had never, although they were very strict, conservative, doctrinally proper believers, they never really talked about their faith because they didn't have any non-Christian friends. They hung around at church and home. And so they learned for the first time to talk in a more winsome, creative way for people that were hurting about the Christian faith. And so they began to find joy in sharing this grief group and sharing good news with others. So anyway, he tells that story, and at the heels of that story, he said, in an odd way, John and Maria began to taste new hope, to be truly human, to feel, to doubt, to struggle, to seek, to ask, to knock without having an immediate answer or much of an answer at all. They felt alive, raw, and full of sorrow, but also life and death and hope in ways they had never known before. They began to see a change in their character and experience freedom to talk to others about their most cherished convictions in a winsome and compassionate way. The healing process for them actually, although it was raw and painful, made them more alive to human feeling, which is what we're going to talk about later. Feelings. What is that Irenaeus quote from the 2nd or 3rd century where the guy said, the glory of God is a human fully alive. Jesus is not trying to transform us to take us to heaven to become angels. He's got enough angels. We're not angels. We're people. And he wants us to be alive, human life. John 10:10 says, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. And so this abundant real world life, which includes feeling feelings, including bad feelings, makes you maybe raw, but alive. And there's something amazing about a human that feels the whole variety of feelings that are out there, feels the feels, as the kids say today. And anyway, he tells the story of those people, and then he begins to reflect on it. He says, okay, hope focuses not on circumstances, but on Christ's coming and the redemption of our character. If my hope is centered on getting a new job or being healed from an illness, then I've given my heart to what is tangible and material. My heart will never become any bigger than that in which I hope. Isn't that an interesting line? My heart will never get any bigger if I put my hope in just, I really hope, like you hope it doesn't rain. But if all you've got is this hope that my pain goes away, or that my life gets better, or that I get a new job, as fine as those things are to wish for, that's as big as you're going to get. He's calling us to a bigger hope. He says, but when my hope is centered on the coming redemption, I begin to take on its big picture and glory. As I become more and more molded by the far future of the kingdom coming, the now becomes both more bitter, because we see it's not here, and sweet. Bitter in that it is not enough. Sweet is that it is a foretaste of what lies ahead. Does that make sense to you? That actually the Christian life gets worse before it gets better, or it gets worse and better at the same time. The more we long for God's kingdom coming and pray that prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and we realize that prayer is not answered in our lives, at least for most of it is not. We don't see God's will coming. It makes us both more bitter and sad, but also more diligent to be hopeful. Does that make sense? It's just not an ever-increasing path towards joy. At least that's what he's suggesting.
You're speaking, I think, about Christian people, but people who don't have faith, when they go through all that, they give up.
People do. Yeah. And at the end of the day, if you have a philosophy of that, it's called nihilism. You end up believing nothing. And so you can kill yourself.
So, I mean, so we can go on.
Yeah.
It gets better, it gets worse, it gets
Yeah.
better, and we can have hope, but many people just
Don't even have that. I often say that after a meaningful, hard, good, redemptive funeral. How do people cope if they don't believe they're going to see their loved one again, if they don't have the hope of the gospel? How do they get through anything? I have no idea.
We have sticky brains too, so like what sticks is the negative
Huh.
a lot more readily than the positive.
Yeah.
It's almost like subconsciously we assume the goodness
Uh-huh.
of the world,
Uh-huh.
so that when something bad happens, it really causes our brains to fire off saying alarm, alarm, alarm. And so it's easy in a world where there is real pain and you're praying and it's not coming, for that to become your whole focus.
Huh.
And so like in the psych hospital I worked at for several years, one of the major activities we had every day was a list of gratitude.
Huh.
Because it helps you just reset to go,
Yeah.
okay, as much as my brain is firing off on the negative things that
Yeah.
are real in the world,
Yeah.
they're not, they are real.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's real evil,
Yeah.
there's real
Yeah.
pain. There's sometimes our prayers don't get answered when we pray for justice and
Yeah.
it doesn't come. But that's not the whole story.
Yeah.
But our brains tend to grab.
So the gratitude journal becomes a pretty radical tool
Right.
to help us focus on the beauty and goodness that is in the world that is yet a foretaste of what's yet to
Right,
come.
and
So
that works with believers and
Yep,
non-believers.
yep,
I mean,
yep.
they sit around and look at, well,
really good. Thank
I'm
you.
grateful for this and this.
Yeah.
It kind of helps you reset your
Yeah.
brain.
Good, good. That's very helpful. He says here, there is an ancient faith in us, a memory from Eden that resounds in us as we recall our past and read about the promises of the future. Hope is leaning into the unknown, risking our lives for a future that is promised in the Word and tasted in a few hors d'oeuvres from our story. He calls earlier he said hors d'oeuvres. There's a feast coming, you know, and the things of life now that are enjoyable are hors d'oeuvres. They're just little tastes before you go into the big banquet. And he thinks that, and he describes even human pleasures and sexuality and big meals that are just foretastes of the kingdom come. To remember the future is to see tomorrow through the eyes of yesterday. What was yesterday? The loss of a job, victimization, bottomless grief, pointless sacrifice that brought little good? Or was it a deep struggle, an intense drama and terror that eventually brought us to our knees and up to the face of God? Everything hinges on the past, he says. We will project the past into every new moment. That's sort of what you were saying about these sticky negative brains. We will project the past into every new moment and either repeat our past themes of victimization, that, oh, we're just a victim, or marvel at the work of God in redeeming us in spite of our questions and doubts. So he asks, what divides the two paths? The sticky brain negativism that just strikes you from remembering only the bad stuff, then hurts from the past, or some glimmer of hope? He said, what divides the two paths, the healing path from the path of victimization? The answer is simple: desire. C.S. Lewis said it is the aspiration that changes the heart. Mere desire. Desire that settles not for an approximation for what our hearts long for, but presses on to imagine the ultimate and total fulfillment that will drench us in joy. To remember the future, that's an interesting phrase. To remember the future is to dream, to imagine redemption won in the wake of innocence lost. It is to surrender to our insatiable impulse to see the broken pieces of our past cemented together into a stronger whole that existed before our innocence was shattered. That's an allusion, by the way, to an earlier story that he told when early on in their wedding he grabbed a vase that was just beautiful and meant a lot to his wife, given by one of their relatives, and he smashed it. He was so mad. And then he felt so terrible, and he went out and bought a new one. And she said, it's just not the same. You know, thank you for trying, but that's not the real thing. But she patched up the old one, glued it. And so it's really pretty, but there's these thin hair-like cracks in it that reminds them of the brokenness, but yet the hope that it's going to be restored. It was sort of what is that Japanese form of art they talk about? You paint it with gold, right? And it becomes even more, the fractures become even beautiful and part of the vase now. Yeah. So that's sort of what he's alluding to there. To remember the future is to recall and recollect the Exodus drama that took us to the edge of despair only for the waters to part. We move into the future not with a map, a plan, or a clear structure, but with the whisper of a story that reminds us that we will again see the goodness of God in the land of the living. The whisper is the voice of God's Spirit reminding us of the cross and our individual moments of Exodus. The whisper is also our own voice that mimics the Spirit by calling out memories to the stage and seeing the themes of redemption time and time again in our lives. God reminds us, we replay the stories, and then we move into the future with the confidence that God is good. That strikes me as some sort of helpful advice, replaying these stories of God's Exodus moments in our lives where he has been faithful, where he has shown up. We have to maybe think about that a little bit, and we replay them on the stage of our memories, which allows us to risk moving into the future with hope. How does hope grow, he asks? It grows in the soil of daily faithfulness as we live for something bigger than ourselves. Hope is a muscle that must be nourished and exercised daily to grow through the normal nutrients of knowing and doing God's will. I wish hope progressed naturally and easily, just as our body develops from infancy to adulthood. Instead, hope grows through encounters that require us to risk, to struggle, to surrender, and to wait. And then he goes on and describes each of those 4 parts: risk, struggle, surrender, and waiting. There's some beautiful writing in here, and I think it's wise, and he has lots of Bible pieces. He looks at the biblical theme of the day of the Lord in the Old Testament, when there's this sort of almost apocalyptic moment of evil being destroyed and goodness and feasts breaking out. And he said there's sort of this theme of that he... Anyway.
It's
Well,
interesting that talking about hope, you start to talk about not just the future, but the past.
Yeah. And he says, remember the future, and it's based on the past. That's all just so interesting to me. Now, I don't know if that's a feeling. It doesn't seem to be like a feeling. It's a process and a mental energy of exploring God's faithfulness in the scriptures and in your life and replaying them, honoring the past and the brokenness, and yet looking for that healing. So it's work to risk and struggle and surrender and to wait on God to show up.
Wendell-Berry, I'm not sure if it's Wendell-Berry or whether it's Eugene Peterson, but I know Wolf talks about how there's some things that will be forgotten and need to be forgotten. And there's some ways in which a person of faith, even with trauma in their past, can find God at work there in their past, which is sounds strange, but people who aren't open to faith or whatever, that are shut down or don't want that, will always see, they'll remember differently. It's always more, it's just more, you can't redeem your past if you don't have faith right now.
Yeah.
It's strange.
Yeah.
It works there.
Well, anyway, last week we talked about doubt. Thomas's good effort to know what the evidence is and to take faith on the questions of doubt. And we assured everybody that it's okay, it's a normal thing, it's a good thing. And then there's this question of hope, which I'm not sure has to do with doubt. I don't think some of us doubt the creedal doctrines. We doubt the process that God is at work in our lives. We get jaded or cynical, or we don't look, or we get stuck in our past and our pain. And so we can't imagine that vase being healed with the beauty of the brokenness woven right into the painting, right into the ceramic. So that's why I kind of wanted to talk about hope, because it isn't exactly doubt if you're not experiencing hope, and it's not just a feeling. I don't know what even a feeling is. I mean, I'll say this much as we move into this question of how we feel about this stuff. Feelings, I mean, themselves are funny. I'm trying to even come up with a definition. What is a feeling? I don't even know. But I want to say this much at least. There are some feelings that are rooted in the body. I mean, if you have a headache, you feel crummy and you can't think right and it hurts. There are more people with chronic pain now than ever time that they've been recording it. There was an article in the New York Times a month ago about how many people have inexplicable chronic pain. Now, some of it's because of anxiety in our modern times, but there's more pain. So there's physical pain, which makes you edgy. I mean, some women who have their periods, I mean, there's times when people have physical postpartum depression. You know, I mean, there's things bodily happening in your hormones and your chemicals that affect how you feel. And that's the way God made it. And in a broken world, we feel crummy when our bodies aren't in tune. But some feelings are themselves physical or rooted in brain studies or physicality. So we just have to admit that too. I want to say that feelings are legitimate. And I think in this crowd, in this group, and folks watching at home, if you're there, chime in. Sally will see if anybody says anything, if any of you are out there. But I don't think we have to remind ourselves too much of this, but in some circles, we really need to say that feelings are legitimate. They're good gifts of God, and like anything else in the world, it is fundamentally a good thing that we have feelings. God made Adam and Eve and said it was good. So the human experiences of feeling things, joy and sadness, are good. In a fallen, sinful, ideologically wrecked, messed up world, we've been trained to have our feelings not what they ought to be, so they are both good, but broken, distorted, okay? Jesus says, quoting one of the Psalms, be angry, but sin not. So even anger can be a good thing, right? And you can do it right or you can do it wrong. So it's not so much that feelings are bad or that even anger is bad. You can have anger and sin not, Jesus says. I don't know exactly what that looks like, righteous anger. But apparently you can do it and you can pull it off. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Oh, come on. Don't worry about it. Turn that darn thing off. What's the matter with you? I feel awful about this.
I'm trying to help, and I made it worse.
So using this model that we often talk about in this class of creation, fall, redemption, the story is that things are made good, they're messed up, and Jesus is making them new again. So our feelings are inherently good, can be distorted because of sin, but we can live into them in righteous, redemptive ways that are touched by the Spirit and Christ-like, right? Be angry and sin not. So there's a way to handle your even anger and emotions properly. So they're essentially good is the first point. That if you feel things, that's okay. It's again, creatureliness needs to be affirmed. We are human creatures and God made us with limits and feelings. I mean, you get tired. That's the way it's meant to be. I don't think it's because of the fall or because we're sinful that we get tired. We just get tired. You need rest. It's the way God made us. So you get cranky. I mean, that's just the way it is. So that's not because of sin. That's just because of our humanness. So we sometimes say, well, we're only human. Well, of course we're only human. That is exactly what we are. That shouldn't be a complaint. It should be a joy. We are only human, and that's how God wants it to be. So feeling things is good. We live in a real world, so that's how we... I mean, again, the doctrine of creation is so important here in the Reformed tradition, as is the doctrine of incarnation. That Jesus became human and experienced things that we experienced. Okay, so you know all that. The full expression of our humanness is the goal. The glory of God is a human fully alive, so we get all that. Sanctification, the process of growing into Christ-likeness, is not a super spiritual sort of state that we get into or a gloss over our humanness, but a transformation of our character and a redirection of our lives. So redemption is like we're in the kingdom of darkness, we get into the kingdom of light. So it's a new direction, but we're still human. And we still feel all the feels, and that's as it was meant to be. So if you don't believe me in that, we need a theology or a spirituality of emotions, we might want to call them. But let's just call out a whole bunch of Bible verses and show that the Bible says this stuff. Please.
We have two comments. Michelle says, one of the first Christian books I read in the 80s, other than the Bible, was a sweet little book called Hope Has Its Reasons, Surprised by Faith in a Broken World by Rebecca Pippert.
Yep.
Very approachable and helpful.
Yeah. Hope Has Its Reasons is a great book, and it's not that simple and short. It's a serious book, but it's really nice. Becky Pippert.
Emily says,
And she spoke in this church, by the way, about that book. We brought Becky in. That's probably where she bought it.
Emily says, in my studies to become a spiritual director, we learn about the importance of desire. Learning to discern the difference between desires that are attachments or idols and desires that come from who we are as God created us to be takes time. I love that the bridge from despair to hope is the desire, places in our heart by God to reach for shalom.
Oh, that's so well put. Thank you, Emily. Yep. Good. Yep. And she has said that before, Emily, who is a spiritual director, as is Chris, her husband, growing into this guidance of the inner life. But this attachment being idolatrous and healthy desire. Yeah. Well, we've talked about that we're supposed to feel feelings. Let me just call out a whole bunch of Bible verses. We're not even going to look them all up, but I'm just going to call them out. And if you think of others or you want to comment on these, just flag me down. This is just the Psalms. The Psalms are a tool to pray and use that cover all the human experiences. And by the way, I think next week we're going to cope a little bit more, or look a little bit more at this particular feeling of grief and hardship, and by way of looking at laments in the Psalms. So Stephanie's going to do a lesson on the lament Psalms next week, because about a third of the Psalms at least are laments. Brokenheartedness, just being overwhelmed. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, says Psalm 34:8. Experiencing physical pain, or maybe it's emotional pain. I am afflicted and in pain, the writer of Psalm 69 says. I am lonely and afflicted, Psalm 25 says. Loneliness. Awe. How about awe? Let the inhabitants of the word stand in awe of him. That's Psalm 33. Sorrow. I spent my life with sorrow. I spent my life with sorrow, he says in Psalm 31. Being sorry, which is different than sorrow. I am sorry for my sins. I guess that's regret, Psalm 38. In Psalm 42, he talks about turmoil. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why is there turmoil within me? Turmoil. What's another word for that? Disquieted. It might be interesting to see other modern translations, how they put that turmoil. I have one friend that paraphrased it into a song, and he said, why am I so buckled over deep down? Why am I so just turmoil, and I'm broken and buckled over deep down, cast down? So if you ever feel that way, in Psalm 42, verse 5. Shame, we've talked about shame. Psalm 44, just for instance, says, shame has covered my face. I mean, it's a poem, it's a song. But he's singing out to God, crying out like a prayer. Shame has just covered my face. There's exaltation, of course. There's marvel, there's delight, there's joy, there's gladness, which is different. There's zeal, there's passion. There's anger, be angry and sin not. It's in a psalm, and then Jesus quotes it. Fear, serve the Lord without fear. But that implies he's in fear. In fact, you read Psalm 4, there's some stuff about fear. Inner peace. In peace I will lie down and sleep. Does anybody know that one? That's Psalm 4 also. He's actually developing a theology of rest and sleep, but it comes to peace. I think that sort of means inner peace. Grief, of course, there's plenty on grief. My eyes wasted away because of grief. He cried so much. That's Psalm 6. The very desire. Oh, Lord, you hear the desire of your people and the desire of the afflicted. Isn't that an interesting phrase? The desire of the afflicted. That's Psalm 10. Probably the desire of the afflicted is to get better, right? A desire to have some hope, to have some healing, to say what's going on. Psalm 36, weeping may tarry for the night. What's the rest of the phrase? But joy comes in the morning. Sometimes these passages sort of say there is hardship and there will be joy. There is sadness at night, but in the morning you're eventually going to experience. I think in the New Testament there's a shift where you begin to experience the joy in the sorrow. It's not just this sorrow that you hope is going to yield to joy, but Paul talks about rejoicing in your sorrow, that somehow God shows up even in your grief and you rejoice for the bad things that happen because somehow it draws you closer to God. Now that's a paradox and can be used in a terribly shaming way. Oh, you're supposed to rejoice when something bad happens and they don't let you voice the laments. So we don't want to use that as a cover-up to put down people that are honest about their feelings, as all these psalmists are. But there is a mystery in Paul where it's not just there was hardship at night, but joy breaks out later. There's joy in the suffering. That's a mystery. We'll get to that again. I mean, I just think of Philippians, right? They call it the epistle of joy. Where was he when he wrote it? He was in prison. And if anybody's ever been incarcerated, it ain't fun. I can tell you that. Sometimes joy is restored after suffering, and there was crying at night, but there'll be joy later. But sometimes the joy is in the pain. Listen to Ann Voskamp. This is a quote I found by this writer, Ann Voskamp. She says, "Joy and pain, they are but two arteries of the one heart that pumps through all of those that don't numb themselves to real living." Let me read that again. Ann Voskamp says, "Joy and pain, they are but two arteries of the one heart that pumps through all of those who don't numb themselves to real living." Real living is going to experience both pain and joy. And for some of us, the one is more than the other, perhaps. It's hard. And it's happy. But anyway.
I had a pastor maybe 20, 25 years ago suggested that when we're going through something hard, to go someplace where you can read Psalm 22 out loud, as loud as you need to, read Psalm 22 first, and then read Psalm 23. And that Psalm 23 then becomes a place where real healing can happen once you've identified all the...
Because Psalm 22 is a little more angry with the laments and stuff, right? We're going to look at that next week.
I'm sorry.
That's a great, I'm just saying, Stephanie, 22 and into 23. That's very, very good. That's really good. And see, using the Psalms, we'll talk about this next week, as a tool to help us give voice to these things, yelling them out loud. Yeah, we're gonna look at that. I think our emotions are somehow, I wrote here, wired into our nature. And so they become, here's what one book said, gauges, but not guides. Gauges. In other words, they reveal to you what you really care, what your desires are. So if you're really upset that you didn't get this job, you must really want that job. And then you have to ask the hard question, is that good or not? Have you made it into an idol and you don't trust God? Like God's not good enough for you? You got to have God and the job? Or are your desires able to be ordered in such a way that you love the right things in the right way? Okay, maybe you didn't get that invited to that party. But can you live with that? Are you okay with God being your pleasure instead of the party being your pleasure? Now again, there's nothing wrong with the pleasure of being invited to a party, and there's nothing wrong with having friends. But if you are lonely, maybe God could be enough for you. And so if you're really, really bummed out, it's a gauge that reveals something about what's going on in your heart of hearts. There's no easy answers there. I'm not trying to say this in a shameful way, but I think they're not guides. You can't just run with every feeling you got, because your feelings could be inappropriate in a Christian way. But it's not that the feeling itself is bad, it's just how you're running with it might be. So they're gauges, not guides. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Does that make sense, that your emotional life, as you become more richer and in tune with the various feelings you have, not numbing yourself to life like Ann Voskamp comes, but wanting to be fully alive and attentive to these things, then how do you handle these feelings?
I watch, when you're watching TV, you see like a culture where drinking is the automatic go-to to placate.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a given that that's what happens. Or marijuana or whatever it is. I don't judge, because it's like feelings are real.
Yeah.
And they're very hard to feel. And so we don't want to be overly judgmental of people who are medicating themselves.
Yeah.
But it's just not a helpful way to do it.
That's putting it mildly. That's putting it graciously.
No, I mean, you can literally
Yeah.
numb out for 24
Yeah.
hours or do
Yeah.
whatever, and you just get through that 24
Yeah.
hours till you feel some sort of distance from the feeling.
Yeah.
But it's not healthy to numb
Sure.
when you have feelings.
And what else can we numb our feelings with?
Food,
Food?
Work,
Work?
TV.
TV? Sort of mindless entertainment. Or even really engaging, you can binge watch really good stuff that makes you feel a lot of things. But they aren't your feelings now, they're stimulated by this passionate show you're watching. Pornography, I think, for some people. There's all kind of different things that we can do to avoid who we really are and what God might be saying in our lives. So we're numbing it. That alcohol and booze does that most obviously, the most in our culture. And by the way, I forget the exact verses, but there's like more than one verse in the Bible that says you can drown out your sorrows in sweet wine. That's what it says. What time is it? I left
Is
my.
that a prescription?
I left my.
Peace.
I left my phone. What time do we have?
10:20.
Okay, thank you. Well, look. Now the question is joy a feeling? All the good teachers, you've heard it, we've heard sermons on it. Joy is not the same as happiness. We got some preachers in the room. I can't even explain all this, but we know that joy is not happiness, right? You can be joyful even though you're bummed out, and you can experience grief but find some joy in the midst of that. Joy is a richer, deeper experience of trust and gladness in God's provision and the hope for the kingdom, the optimistic kingdom vision we have of the hope of redemption, even in our pain. So it's not happy clappy, just being cheerful. Put on a nice face. You should smile more. No, it's not that. But what is joy? It's hard to describe. It's what C.S. Lewis finally in his memoirs called Surprised by Joy. It's the final thing that led him to God, that he realized that he longed for something that would transcend the experiences of life and give him ultimate beauty and goodness and joy. Well, there's a book here called An Invitation to Joy, The Divine Journey to Human Flourishing, by a guy who says, I'm not real happy, and he himself is battling cancer. And he said, I'm not likely to be theologically or personality or my circumstances a very cheerful guy right now. And so he felt led to write a book about joy. And it's a realistic, sober account of what joy can be and what it is and what it isn't. And I haven't read it all, but can I read just a little bit to you? Maybe this will help. He's talking here about joy and suffering. There's a whole chapter about that. Joy in the midst of suffering, even. And I'll just read this one part. Maybe it's helpful. One key to understanding this seeming contradiction, that we're supposed to have joy in sorrow, is that the word, I don't want to read all that. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. What else? Here, I'll start here. I could read the whole chapter. As long as we are consumed with our affliction, unable to see any purpose or meaning in our suffering, and unwilling to consider God's presence and his perspective in our losses, we will miss out on the value that suffering can bring to our lives. For Christians, there is a spiritual reality that influences the way we view our experience of pain and suffering. It is clear that there are differing ways of interpreting the same set of facts or circumstances. So what is this different perspective, this alternative viewpoint that can allow us to rejoice in our suffering? There is certainly a joy that comes when we experience relief or healing from our afflictions, granted. But the joy that can be ours in the crucible of suffering comes from an understanding that these trials do not signal the absence of God, but rather a wonderful awareness of God's presence and comfort, and a confidence that he can use these trials for our good. When we are suffering, and like Job, we cry out, why? We don't really want some philosophical explanation, some rational understanding. What Job needed and what we need is to know God's presence, to know that he cares, that he has not abandoned us. The Almighty finally speaks to Job in the thunderstorm. And Job is strangely at peace. In Job 42, he says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. We have the same assurance because our God cared so much that he entered our world, took on our flesh, experienced our suffering, and died our death. Think of Philippians 2, the great passage of Jesus giving up his divinity and coming into earth. What I hope, not giving up his divinity, but giving up the privileges of his divinity and coming into earth. What I hope is clear by now is that I am not suggesting any denial or pretending about our circumstances. When James says about suffering, count it all joy, he is not suggesting that his fellow believers pretend that the pain is not real, or that they should deny the reality of their present circumstances. Rather, he is appealing them to take this different view of this real suffering. Not simply an eternal viewpoint, though that is part of it, but of a divine understanding. What is God doing in this? How is God present in this? What possible meaning or purpose could this have? How could this adversity be used to transform my character? How might God help me to respond to this suffering in a healthy, honest, and redemptive manner? How can I be more present to others? So on a practical level, how can we still have joy in the midst of suffering? And then he begins to tell some stories of people that have done that. Is that clear that he's not saying we cover up our pain or our brokenness or pretend it's happy or pretend it's all good or pretend that God did it all? Like it's one easy answer. Oh, well, it's all God's sovereign plan. Some are hyper-reformed people just slough off everything. As every single thing happens, it's God's will and that's that. So you get with the program. I don't think that's exactly what he's saying. But God can be present in it. What's that verse in Romans 8:28? Does anybody know that verse?
Nothing can separate us. No.
For he causes all things,
God causes all things for good.
causes all things for good.
Emily
He doesn't say he causes all things, but he can work all things for good. Romans 8:38, I think it is. Please, what's Emily say here? We need her.
says, here's the question. Is the pain bringing us closer to God or farther from God? Does it cause us to seek God or turn our back?
I'm glad she wasn't asking that as a question. Yes, that is the question. Thank you, Emily. Again, really good. Read that again.
Here's the question. Is the pain bringing us closer to God or farther from God? Does it cause us to seek God or turn our back?
Is that helpful? I know many of us in this room have experienced
All things work
unbearable.
together for
Yeah, all things work together for good. Romans 8:38.
For those who love God and are called according to
Yeah.
his purpose.
Yeah, thank you. So it doesn't say he caused it, but he can work it and cause it for good. I cling to that. I know there are people in this room that have suffered immensely. Many of you have just suffered so much. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot and make you talk, but is this making sense that we don't cover up our pain, but we find God's presence in it, maybe even joy, and that's more than a feeling. You don't have to be happy about stuff. So we can say Christ is risen indeed, and in this Easter time walk with some sort of hope for the future, because we're remembering the past, like Dan Allender said. We can risk enough to believe that the kingdom is coming and continue to pray this robust prayer of looking forward to and allowing that to shape our now. I like this idea that things are hors d'oeuvres, that there is a feast to come, that God will make all things new. And so when we see little things now that work well, we could view them as hors d'oeuvres, foretastes of the goodness and the straightening out and the rightness that God is bringing in our lives. So it's not in any way covering up the pain. It's not in any way saying we're not uncomfortable. It may just be a biological thing that you got a headache. And so you need an aspirin. Or there's this deeper question of where is God in the midst of this? How does Romans 8:38, where he will cause all things to work for good for those that are called according to his purposes?
When I think of some of the difficult things I've been through throughout the years, when another thing comes, I tend to look back and think, well, God got me through that.
Yeah.
God will get me through this next thing.
Yes.
that's happening.
Yes.
I don't have to like it.
Yeah.
And I don't have to revel in it, but I believe the presence of God is there.
Yeah. Amen.
His promises are true. I mean, all that he promised to the kings,
Yeah.
he did
Yeah.
all these things to the kings, but then he brought the line through David,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
eventually.
Yeah.
And I just know God is with me. And
Yeah.
it sounds simplistic, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
still hard.
Yeah. Do you mind me asking, when you were hit by that baseball, you were messed up for a pretty long time. That took a long time to get better, right?
Yeah.
How long were you in the hospital for?
Well, I was only in the hospital for, I think, 10 days.
10 days, that's a lot of time.
I mean, then I had to go back again because I had some leakage and all
Yeah.
that stuff. And then I had different surgeries and whatnot.
So it went
That's
on.
not the only hard thing that
Yeah,
happened in
sure.
my life. That prepared me for some of the other hard things
Yeah.
that came later on
Yeah.
in my life. And I
Yeah.
thought, God, if you like that baseball. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
I got through that, I'm going to be able to get
Training ground. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought, my daughters will get married and I'll never smell their flowers. Or I'll have grandchildren, I'll never smell that talcum powder. I'll
Yeah.
never smell. All those
Yeah.
things have happened and I haven't smelled it and it's been good.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's been okay.
And
It's been good. Thank you. There is this verse that says, the joy of the Lord is my strength. The joy of the Lord is even a song. The joy of the Lord is my strength. That comes from the end of the Old Testament after the exile. It's in Nehemiah, and Ezra and Nehemiah have this big Sunday school event where they rediscover in the rubbles of the exile the old scrolls. And they call people forth and they just preach for days and they feast for days So there's a celebration, and then they have a solemn. It's almost like we have it backwards. We party hardy for the weekend, and then we go to church one day. It's like they're partying for all week, and then they have a solemn assembly one day. So they're having this major feast and party because they so are impassioned with the discovery of the law that they had lost during exile. And so there's this period of exile, this horror of both punishment and the consequences of injustice or whatever, but God gives them another chance, and they're finally restored, and the promises are true, and the flow of promise and deliverance happens, and they're now rebuilding the city, and they discover the law, and they have this days and days of teaching. The Feast of Booths comes out of that, the Jewish ceremony, and they party, and then this phrase is used, the joy of the Lord is my strength.
So that fits beautifully. Michelle writes, a large part of the pain is when the people you love aren't believers. Where is the hope for them?
Oh, yeah. The bell is ringing. We're almost out of time, so this will be the appropriate last word.
Talking about joy, one way you can feel joy is I went back to my volunteer job yesterday at the hospital in the NICU, and I was holding these babies, and sometimes they were awake, sometimes they were asleep, but they smiled. They got this smile, and there just is no better joy than looking down and seeing this little smile. No matter how bad you feel, it makes you smile when you see a baby.
And maybe that's this gratitude journal that Kyle was talking about. Maybe that's part of it. That's an hors d'oeuvre. That little moment that's built into the creation of you volunteering and caring for a sick baby and seeing that smile in the midst of that rough situation. That's a powerful parable. Thank you. Well, we've just scratched the surface of this joy and hope and doubt and fear and pain. But next week we're going to look at the Psalms of Lament, which actually is going to be a good Bible study, not just highlighting a bunch of verses, but actually digging into a couple of them. So maybe we'll yell 22 and then we'll find hope in 23, like you suggested, Sally. Thank you. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.